thing I want to talk about really quick before we get started, a couple of announcements, I guess. The lake cleanup that we talked about last week, I got a location. It's Cooper's Branch Boat Ramp, which is like 10 minutes that way, out 20, so super convenient to campus. Some of you guys have emailed me that you're interested. If you have decided that you might be interested, but you haven't even emailed me, you can certainly still do that. Or you can stop by and just give me your name on the way out. So if you guys want to do that cleanup thing, it's like an hour or two Saturday morning to pick up trash from the lake while the water's down, which could be a pretty cool opportunity to get involved, but also earn some bonus for the class. So let me know if you're interested in that. That was one thing I was going to say. Yeah, so attendance and the lake sign up thing on your way out. What else did I put up here? So I posted some announcements for you guys. Pop this into full screen here. All right, to-do list for this week. If you haven't done your syllabus quiz, go ahead and do that. That's just to make sure that you can use Respondus software on your computer before we ever get to an exam. So our first exam is still a couple of weeks away, but if you do that quiz before tomorrow night, you'll get 2 bonus points for being on the ball with that. So take care of that. Your first participation grade, 10 points. These are not bonus points, these are regular points to introduce yourself. So some of you guys have sent me those. I've got probably about half of all my students for the semester that have already sent me those. So I've got about 60. So if you haven't gotten a response from me yet, you will, just hang in there. I get a ton of them right in the beginning of the semester, but keep sending those. So that's actual class points, so make sure that you've done that. I added a survey that the department asks for us to have you guys fill out about your sort of thoughts, feelings, mindset going into your STEM classes. And so there's a little link here. It's pretty short. A couple of you guys have already done that. If you do that survey by, whatever I said, I don't think I put a due date, sometime soon, you get 2 bonus points for doing that as well. So like, all I do is give away bonus, right? So far. Click on the link when you finish the survey. It'll give you like a thank you for taking the survey page. Screenshot that and submit it on D2L. There's a submission box. If you just click here in the announcement, you can get there, but you can also get there through assessments, assignments. Okay. Pre-course mindset survey bonus. So pop your screenshot in there, and that's 2 bonus points for doing that. Let's see what else is on here. The lake thing, cool. And then this is an old announcement because that was yesterday at 5 about checking your schedule. So if you're sitting here, you probably took care of that if you needed to. So those are announcements for that. The other couple of things I wanted to mention before we get back into talking about evolution again are Kahoot and Lab. So Lab starts next week. I did work it out to where we can meet all together. So if you are in Monday's Lab, we are meeting Monday, everybody. Okay. If you're in Wednesday's Lab, we are meeting next Wednesday, everybody. So we're not going to have to split the groups because I got the ballroom over in the Student Center, which is set up for classes to meet in now, just because it's good for social distancing, so we can all meet together. So everybody comes to Lab next week on Monday or Wednesday. Good. Okay. And then I'll give you more info on the location because we'll head over there right after class next week. So just if you don't know where the ballroom is, don't panic. We'll talk about that when the time comes. You guys excited to get started with Lab? Some of you are slightly nodding. It's going to be fun. It's going to be great. We're going to do real science. It'll be fun. Okay. The other thing was Kahoot. Yeah, how many of you have used Kahoot before? Yeah, so quite a few of you are probably familiar with it. If you have it set up on your phone already or your laptop or whatever device you use, just a quiz app. We'll start using that for review, little games here and there in class. So I'll probably do the first one Monday at the end of chapter 18. So we'll be using that as a review tool. If you're not familiar with Kahoot, just go online and look it up, Kahoot, and get yourself set up to use that quiz app. It's free and easy, and people usually think it's fun. So we'll use that to sort of break things up and ask some questions in class. So we'll start that next week as well. All right, I think that's it for announcements. Questions or comments before we get started back into lecture? All right. Okay, so let me put this up in full screen so we can all see it well. Okay, so I'm actually going to back up one slide so we can sort of review where we were. when we left last Wednesday. We got to the point where we were talking about variation and adaptation. We were talking about where variation in populations comes from, genetic variation, right? What was that ultimate source of variation that we discussed? Mutation, yeah, so just changes in the genome that may or may not persist. If they persist and they affect the phenotype of the characteristic that they code for, then it can affect whether an organism is fit or, say, unfit for that particular environment. And then those traits can persist. And that's how we see changes in the gene pool over time, which is what? Changes in the gene pool of a population of organisms over time due to natural selection and other influential mechanisms. What's that definition? Evolution, right? I told you to hear it over and over, right? All right, cool. Cool. All right, so we're getting really close to sort of switching gears and starting to talk about patterns of evolution. But before we get there, I just want to sort of sum up what we've been talking about. I want you guys to make sure that you are comfortable with the definition of an adaptation. So we use the term adaptation to mean a lot of different things when we're just sort of talking, right? Like you can adapt to your circumstances, right? If somebody throws a surprise at you, you can sort of react to that and adjust, right? But we're not really talking about adaptation in terms of adjusting. We're talking about adaptations in terms of characteristics. Okay, so the biological definition of an adaptation that you guys should be familiar with is this one, a heritable trait, right? It has to be genetic, and it has to be a characteristic or a phenotypic display representation of the genotype, right? And it aids in the survival and reproduction of an organism in its present environment. So remember that present environment or local environment, that's always key when we're talking about fitness or adaptations, yes? So an adaptation can be also described as a match of an organism to its environment. So it's a trait that is favorable at that moment, at that place and time in the environment. So let me ask you this. Could a trait be considered an adaptation to a particular environment and then later, with environmental changes, be considered a maladaptation? Yeah, sure, right? So it's always going to depend on the conditions, the environmental conditions, what makes a trait good or bad, advantageous or deleterious, right? Beneficial or put you at a disadvantage. So we talked about the finches. I know you guys remember that. So large beaks on finches would be advantageous when large seeds are abundant. Yes? Because those are what those beaks are, well adapted for cracking. But small beaks are advantageous when larger seeds are scarce and smaller seeds are abundant. So again, just driving home that point that a trait is only really an adaptation if it's a fit for that particular set of environmental circumstances. So does that make sense? Just want to make sure you guys match in your heads adaptation with a trait, right? That gives you an advantage. Okay, cool. So I always like to sort of round out this introduction section of the PowerPoint by looking at this case study. I think it's kind of funny, but maybe I have a twisted sense of humor. But it's got all of the components of natural selection in one sort of little study, okay? So you've got a population of some sort of deer, right? They look like deer, I'm not even sure what they are, some sort of deer-like animal. And the first thing you see is overproduction. So you guys remember those three major traits that Darwin and Wallace both sort of converged on when they were just describing what we now know as natural selection. You had characteristics are inherited, right? You had variation in populations, and you had competition. Right? And that competition piece, that's what we're looking at here, overproduction. There are always more individuals that are born than an environment can support, right? Talked about competition last time. Yes? Okay. So you've got this population, and there are more than you would expect to survive as they start out. You've got variation represented here. So what's the trait that looks different in these guys? What variation can you see? Now, don't say antlers, because you've got, that's just sexual dimorphism, right? Two different forms for females, no antlers, males with antlers. Let's just assume that. So what can you see that's a physical characteristic in this population where there's variation? Yeah, fur coloration, right? So then you see selection in action. So as this population of our deer here goes across this mountain range, something happens. What's going on here? This is the part that I kind of think is funny. I don't know why, probably because, like I said, I'm twisted, but for some reason, which we can't see, the light-colored fur coat animals don't make it, right? They're all just dead. We don't really know why, right? I've had people make hypotheses before, like what could have possibly happened? Well, maybe light fur color goes along with less fat, right? What if you were skinny and you went into the snowy mountains? What happens? Maybe you're cold, right? So who knows, right? And they don't explain that to us either in this graphics, but so we can use our imagination, but it's helpful to sort of see that this particular trait puts these individuals at a disadvantage. And then finally, you see adaptation. The traits of the individuals that survived the trek across the mountains here, which in our case is the dark fur, becomes more common in the later population. So see how that variation with those light fur-colored individuals from over here in number 1, they die off, but the population rebuilds after the migration event, right? But when they do, there are more dark fur-colored individuals because the gene pool has changed, right? Does this make sense? I like this because it's like all right there for you. Yes? All right, so just an illustration of the whole process of natural selection or evolution in action. All right, great. Moving on to patterns of evolution. Some of these definitions you guys have probably heard before. If you haven't, or if you have questions, let me know, okay? So we're going to go through a couple of different types of terms and ways that evolutionary biologists describe these changes in populations over time. And this first set is divergent evolution versus convergent evolution. Okay, and the words mean what they look like they mean. So if you know the terms divergent and convergent, that's what we're talking about. So what does it mean to diverge? You start off on a path and you come to a fork in the path. That path diverges, right, into two different directions. So divergent evolution is when two species evolve from a common point, but they go in two different trajectories. Okay, so we can use this phylogenetic tree. This is a phylogenetic tree. You guys recognize that? Seen this before? Some of you guys mentioned early on that you knew what trees were. So phylogenetic trees are just those graphical representations of relationships between organisms, right? So this is a good one to start with. It's pretty simple. So divergent evolution is represented here. So if you've got, this is a node, okay, we'll spend a chapter talking about trees and we'll learn some tree terminology, but we can go ahead and get started using it now. So that's a node or a branch point in the tree. So this branch here represents a common lineage or a single lineage that has a common ancestor. This node is where these two groups branch, okay? So this is divergence, one lineage that branches into two. So sharks, which fall into the animal group chondrichthyes, we'll get to that after midterm, that just means cartilaginous fish. The skeletons are made of cartilage rather than mineralized bone. That includes the sharks. They are over here on this branch. On the other branch, you've got dolphins and pumas, which are representative of mammals in this particular tree, right? So mammals and sharks are in two different groups of vertebrates, but they're both vertebrates. So they share a common ancestor. That node indicates that branch point. That's divergent evolution. Okay, so millions and millions of years ago, this common ancestor had two groups of individuals that went two different directions and led to chondrichthyes or cartilaginous fish and ultimately mammals in the other direction. Divergent evolution. Make sense? That one's pretty straightforward. Convergent evolution is kind of the opposite, but not really. So it's not as straightforward to describe, but we'll work with different examples of it and make sure that you guys are comfortable understanding what convergent evolution means. So convergent is the opposite of divergent. If diverge means go two directions, converge means come together, right? So when two lanes of traffic merge into one, that's convergence. Yes? Okay, so convergent evolution happens when similar phenotypes or physical characteristics evolve independently in distantly related species. That means that two unrelated or distantly related groups look the same, or behave in the same way, or share some characteristic. But it's not a characteristic that they share because they had a common ancestor, but more likely a characteristic that they share because of shared environmental pressures. Okay, so bear with me here. Let's look at sharks versus dolphins. Okay, so using the same tree, but for a different reason. Now, dolphins are more closely related to pumas because they're both mammals, right? But dolphins are aquatic mammals, so they live in the ocean, right? Everybody knows what a dolphin is. Stop me if I'm making assumptions here, you guys, okay? And sharks, where do sharks live? Also in the ocean, yes? Okay, so there are shared environmental characteristics, shared environmental circumstances of the ocean where the shark lives and the ocean where the dolphin lives. Both of these organisms are well adapted or have characteristics that make them well suited to life in the ocean. Like what? Fins? What about body shape? They're shaped like tapered, right? They can move through the water without a whole lot of drag. It's called fusiform. They're like tube shaped with pointy ends. So they look very similar, but they're distantly related. So this body shape that makes sharks and dolphins both well adapted for moving through the water, that's not an inherited trait that came from a common ancestor. You guys with me so far? And one of the ways you can tell that is that this cat is more closely related to this dolphin than the dolphin is to the shark. Okay? So the dolphin and the cat share a more recent common ancestor than the dolphin and the shark do. You guys with me? Okay, so when we get to the chapter on phylogenetic trees, chapter 20, we'll spend more time reading these trees, but that's what this says, that long ago vertebrates diverged into cartilaginous fish and the group that led to mammals, and then after that divergence, mammals further diverged into lots of different organisms, including us, but on that same tree, you've got pumas and you've got dolphins. Okay, so these guys are more closely related, share a more recent common ancestor with one another than sharks do with either of these guys, okay? Which means if this body shape that's shared by the dolphin and the shark was shared because of common ancestry, then the cat would have it too. Does that make sense? Some of you aren't moving or nodding or anything. If it's not making sense, please let me know, okay? So convergent evolution is just an example of two organisms that look the same, act the same, share some characteristic in common, but they didn't inherit it from a shared ancestor. They evolved it, okay, to fit in their local environment. All right? We'll look at some more examples. There we go. Okay. So when we're talking about convergent evolution, another term to be familiar with is analogous structures versus homologous structures. So we're going to work with those terms as well. Analogous structures that's the term for characteristics that have evolved independently. So convergent evolution produces analogous structures. You guys know what an analogy is? Anybody take the SAT? What's an analogy? This is to this as this is to this, right? It's a comparison. So if that helps you to remember, analogous comes from the same root word as analogy. It's like comparing two things. So these are those traits that look similar, but are not the result of inheritance, okay? So if we look at these three organisms, what do they all have in common structurally? What do you guys notice? Wings. What do they do with those wings? They fly, right? So you've got wings in insects, you've got wings in birds, and you've got wings in bats. But these three animals are in three completely different groups, right? With other organisms that are more closely related to them than any of these three are to each other. Okay, so if we put these guys on a phylogenetic tree, you've got bats in the mammal group, you've got birds in the reptile group, and you've got this fly in insects, right? Arthropoda. So they all have wings and they all use them for flight, but they did not inherit those wings for flight from a shared common ancestor, but that's convergent evolution. Those are analogous structures. Does that help a little bit? Now, if you're talking about characteristics that organisms share in common because they share them, they have a shared common ancestor that also had that trait, then you're talking about homologous and homolog. You guys remember the term homologous pairs from genetics in Bio 1? Homologous means the same, right? It's homologous pairs of genes, right? Chromosomes. They have the same genes on them in the same loci, like chromosome 1 from mom, chromosome 1 from dad. So they're homologous, they're the same. So homology is the same, analogy is comparable. Maybe that helps to keep the two straight. So homologous structures are shared similarities in structure and function that do descend from a common ancestor. So if you want to go back and look at, let's see, how about dolphins and whales? Both mammals, both aquatic, maybe a more recent common ancestor. So those traits might be homologous. Okay, we'll talk more about homologous traits going forward as well. But that's analogy or analogous structures, and that's convergent evolution. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. We'll get more into homology later. We're starting to look at evidence for evolution, so we'll get to that again here in this section. But we're going to look at some ways that evolutionary biologists do their work. Right? Look for evidence of evolution as it's occurring in every level of biological organization. Okay, so from the smallest level, you can look at evolution on the molecular level. So you can take something's DNA and you can sequence the genome and you can compare A's and C's and C's and so on, sequence to sequence, and do evolutionary biology that way. Look for similarities in the sequence, look for differences in the sequence. You're doing molecular evolutionary biology, right? You can look at cellular evolution. You can look at it at the organismal level. You can look at it at the ecosystem level, right? So there are questions that you can ask about how life on Earth has changed over the millennia at all these different levels, okay? And scientists definitely do that. So we're going to take a look at how we use fossils to do that, how we use anatomy and embryology. You guys know what embryology is? What's an embryo? It's like a baby, right? Yeah, it's just past fertilization. So we'll take a look at that. Biogeography, so maps, essentially, and a little bit about molecular biology and a couple other types of evidence that we use in evolutionary studies. All right, what's a fossil? You guys know? For sure you've heard of them before. Where are they found usually? In the ground, yeah. So fossil comes from the word that means to dig. So fossorial is like a digging animal. That's their lifestyle. That's how you describe that. So the word fossil really means to dig or to dig up. Fossils are petrified remains or impressions of organisms that lived prehistorically cast in rock. You guys know what petrified means, like petrified wood? Yeah, preserved. It's like turned into rock, basically. So what happens with something like a fossil, it's organic material like wood or like bone, right, or teeth or something along those lines that gets stuck in the sediment in just the right set of conditions that allow water to leach through it over time. And that water is going to leach out certain organic molecules. Essentially, they dissolve, and then they're replaced by other inorganic molecules until eventually that structure that used to be a living structure, or living tissue, is essentially turned to rock. It's basically petrified. So sometimes you get a fossil that way, and sometimes it's just an impression, right? So a feather falls, and that particular cast is perfectly preserved, right? So fossils are few and far between because they have to form in just the perfect set of circumstances in order for them to be preserved that way. But they're always found in rock in one way or another. The age of fossils can be determined through relative dating, meaning you can use the strata or the levels of the rock in which those fossils are found to figure out how old they are. So if you know how old that rock layer is, you know, and you find a fossil in that rock layer, you can make a prediction or a hypothesis that that's when that organism lived. Does that make sense? So just placing it in the rock layers. Sometimes we use radiometric dating, right, to figure things out, things like carbon-14 or potassium-40, to just age things, figure out how old things are. And then when we talk about the fossil record, we're talking about all the fossils put together to tell the story of life on the planet, right? So do we have a complete fossil record of everything that's ever lived? No, why not? Okay. Yeah, some stuff doesn't fossilize well. Like what? Bones do okay. Soft stuff, right? Flesh, hair, things like that, right? They don't hold up well for that whole mineralization process. So that stuff disappears. Have you guys ever heard about fossils that are found in like bits and pieces? Like, holy cow, we found half of a hip bone. It's a breakthrough, right? But the fossil record has been put together in bits and pieces, essentially. Are there holes in the fossil record? For sure, right? We haven't found fossils of everything that's ever lived here, but if you take the entire collection of all the fossils that we have found and categorize everything and date everything and put it relative to everything else, you can get sort of the collective story. In fact, the fossil record, although it's got gaps, is considered some of the strongest evidence for evolution. Remember early last week when I was first talking about how people started finding fossils and saying like, what is this? This doesn't look like anything that lives here. So the first questions about like where do extinct organisms come from and how do the species change over time started when people started finding fossils, right? So it's a significant contributing line of evidence for evolutionary biology. Just a couple examples, pictures that come from your textbook. These are just examples of hominid evolution, which would be human ancestors and relatives. And then we have a pretty solid fossil record of horse evolution. Horses are native to North America. About 55 million years ago, the oldest fossil of horse relative is identified, Eohippus. Looks kind of like a horse, but it's about the size of a cat. Can you imagine? Weird, right? If you're interested, there's lots of information online. There's a little bit in your textbook. You can read all about the horse fossil record, but it's a good example of a pretty complete record of fossil evolutionary history that we have in Equus, the genus that includes modern day horses. So for fossils, you really just need to know what they are, where they came from, how the fossil record is used as evidence, okay? Before we move on, what kind of evidence is that? Is it anatomical, morphological, molecular? What do you guys think? What are you looking at when you're looking at fossils? A little bit louder, Kevin? Anatomical, yeah, just shape, right? Structure. Can you tell anything about the DNA of an organism from a fossil? Not usually, right? There's some like wild hopes to be able to get, you know, mammoth DNA and stuff like that. But things that are millions of years old, those molecules are long gone. So you're looking at structure, you're looking at anatomy. Okay, so there are limitations to that as well, and we'll sort of talk about that moving forward. Just keep that in the back of your mind for now. All right, back to homology. So here's that example I was telling you guys about. We'll get back to homologous structures. Just as a classic example of homology in vertebrates. Okay, so remember that homologous structures are those that are the same in different species, different groups of organisms, but they are in related organisms who all inherited that trait from a common ancestor. Okay, contrasted with analogous, which is more convergent evolution, right? So homologous structures, these are all four limb bones, like an arm or a wing, from different vertebrates. You've got the human arm, the dog leg, the bird wing, and the whale fin. And the bones are color-coded to show you that they are the same bones. Okay, so the bones that make up your hand and fingers are the same bones that you find in the tips of a whale flipper, in the dog's foot, and in the tip of a bird wing. They're shaped a little bit differently. They're shaped by evolution. They're adapted to their particular life strategy, if you will. But those are the same bones. Not only are they the same bones, but we also know that they come from the same structures embryologically. So when an organism is developing, these things follow the same genetic patterns. They develop as a result of the same genes being turned on and turned off at certain checkpoints through development. So those are homologous. Arm bones are the same, carpals are the same, your wrist bones in yellow. So you can see that even though these are different organisms, they have those same bones, and they have them because of a shared common ancestor that also had those bones. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. That's another good example of homology. Another anatomical type of evidence that we look at are vestigial structures. You guys heard the term vestigial before? Do you know what a vestige is? Vocabulary buffs in here. A vestige is like a remnant or like a leftover, kind of like a clue from the past. The vestigial structures are those that appear in organisms. Oftentimes they don't appear to be functional in that organism, but they're inherited from a common ancestor that did use them. So good examples would be these teeny tiny little pelvic bones in whales. And sometimes some species of whales you can actually see these sticking out through the skin. So they're almost like limb buds, like hind limb buds. That's because whales weren't always in the ocean. So whale evolution has been pretty well documented. And these dudes actually came from ancestors millions of years ago that looked kind of like wolves. Furry, dwelled on the edges of the water, and were four-limbed, right? So the ancestors of whales had hind limbs, but over millions of years of evolution, whales changed, right? They're now fully aquatic. They don't need hind limbs, but they have these little leftovers in their skeleton that you can find. Those would be called vestigial pelvic bones. You guys know what a pelvis is, yes? What are your pelvic bones? Like hips, right? They hold your legs onto your spine, essentially. Snakes have them too. So snakes are legless reptiles, but they weren't always legless. They're descended from an ancestor that had legs, but they lost them throughout their evolutionary trajectory. But some snakes you still can find vestiges, remnants, leftovers of those limb bones in their skeleton, vestigial structures. So although they seem like they're functionless, and they probably are in something like a snake or something like a whale, it's evidence of shared common ancestry. Yeah?
And you're saying the whale that used to be the size of a wolf?
Yeah. I'm going to see.
Yes, actually. It's quite incredible considering they're larger than most boats.
Oh, it was a book. Sorry, I was thinking of this cool picture I just saw yesterday, but it was in a book. It wasn't online.
That's so nice. Do you know what year, time period?
Sorry?
Do you know what year, time period?
I think like 50 million years ago, this thing lived, Pakicetus. This is one of the earlier known relatives of whales.
Could they breathe underwater or?
Nope, terrestrial. But they lived and hunted around the edges of water. So there are certain structures in this guy and some of their other common ancestors, which was Pakicetus is here, A. This is the oldest one. And then these are relatives through the ages. So you can sort of see this one, I think it's called Indohippus maybe, I can't remember the exact name. But that one is almost, they think, lives sort of like a crocodile, like in the shallows, in and out, so not really aquatic. Couldn't breathe underwater, but spent a lot of time hunting in the water. Yeah, pretty cool stuff. Huh? No, and I think even modern day whales don't, right? They come up.
They do.
Yeah. So they still have lungs and stuff. Yeah, I'm not sure about like how long they can go. You know, like whales can go for a while without coming up, but I'm not sure about those. But yeah, if you're interested, look up Pakicetus, read about that. A good bonus question. All right, you guys doing okay? You're very quiet this morning. Not even really more, it's almost lunch. All right, homology and vestigial structures. So those are more anatomical evidence. Moving on again to convergent evolution and analogous structures. Again, we just defined what these are, but how do these provide evidence for evolution? These are not evidence of shared common ancestry, but what is it evidence of? If you've got two organisms, so we talked about sharks and dolphins, best described as adaptations to life in the water. Let's look at the Arctic fox and the ptarmigan. So this guy's a mammal, right? This guy is a reptile, two distantly related vertebrate groups. They both live in the Arctic, like North Pole region, right? What do they have in common? Yeah, they're both white. They blend in with the snow. Both of them also molt. They change color. The fur of the wolf will get more sort of mottly and brown in the spring and summertime, and the ptarmigan's feathers will do the same. Okay, so they change color, they have seasonal coloration differences. They both do that. But do they do that because they have an ancestor that they both share that did that? They don't, right? They both do that because they're well adapted to the conditions that they live in. So the evidence for evolution here is not relatedness, but selection. You guys follow? So it's looking at the pressure that your environment can actually put on an organism that causes those changes over time. So it's a different kind of evidence, but evidence nonetheless. If you are really curious about some other examples, you can look at this article. Okay? Sometimes I'll do that. I'll just toss links in here, and it's not stuff you guys are responsible for. It's just like extra, like stuff about Pachycetus, right? So just things that might be interesting if you want to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole. There are sometimes options. I will also tell you if there is possibility for bonus questions. So on your exams, I always put bonus, but they're usually from these rabbit holes. Okay, so usually the videos, I've got quite a few video links in my PowerPoints that I won't necessarily play in class, but if you watch them on your own time, that's oftentimes where the bonus questions on the exams come from. Okay, so tidbit. All right, embryology and development. So we said an embryo is basically like a baby, right? After fertilization or early in development, before birth, you've got an embryo. Embryos turn into fetuses, and then fetuses become babies, right? So it's part of the developmental process. The interesting thing about embryology is that it's kind of described as having your evolutionary history buried in your developmental processes. So sometimes it seems as though organisms pass through phases of development in which they display traits of a common ancestor that they no longer have, okay? And sometimes you can see similarities in those developmental processes that also provide evidence of relatedness across groups, all right? So comparative embryology is its own branch of biology that compares and contrasts the development of different species. This is a pretty common picture you can find online. If you just Google comparative embryology, you probably find that really quickly as a Google image search. But these are related, distantly related groups of vertebrates. You've got human baby here, rabbit, cat, I think that's a pig, can't read the thing, chick, tortoise, salamander, and fish. So down here, which is later in development, before birth still, but later in the developmental process, they're starting to look very different from one another. But look at this. Early on, they're almost indistinguishable from one another, right? So this is early in embryonic development, and then as you go through your phases of development, which are controlled by genetic signals, right? Which genes to turn on when, where, how they're expressed. Do you make a shell? Do you make feathers? Do you make hair, right? Depending upon what your genes tell you to do as you're developing, you're going to start changing. But early on, they look really similar. And often, as I was saying about the sort of revisiting your evolutionary history during development, structures that are absent in the adult or the juvenile form. Do you guys know what the word juvenile means? What does that mean? Yeah, like a child, like a young one. Yes? So when you're born, but you're not adult yet, you're a juvenile. Structures that can be seen in adults or juveniles can often be, absent in the adult or juvenile can often be seen during development. So a couple of examples of that. All vertebrate groups have gill slits. You guys know what gill slits are? What are gills? Yeah, if you're a fish, right, you breathe using your gills. Well, there are openings, right, those gill slits where water comes in the mouth and out that way, and it passes across those gill structures to get gas exchange to happen, right? That's how they breathe. So did you know that as a vertebrate, you had gill slits at one point? Seems kind of weird, right? Looking to see if you could see it in any of these drawings, you can't really see it very well. Well, we'll talk about this later when we do animal groups and animal development, but they're called pharyngeal slits. It's in your throat. Pharynx means throat, so it's like here. By the time you're born, your gill slits have closed up, okay, as part of the developmental process. In fact, those structures that become gill arches and things like that in fish are going to become things like jawbones and ears in people, okay? So they have a different fate developmentally, but they start out as gill slits. Gill slits are gill slits. It's one of those things that makes you a chordate, a vertebrate, okay? You also had a tail. You can see it here, here, here. The only chordates, the only vertebrate group that, the groups that don't have a tail anymore, by the time they're born are great apes, which includes us, right? Everybody else has that tail, at least some remnant of it. Ours generally disappears by the time you're born. So these are just examples of developmental structures or characteristics that are present during embryonic development that sort of indicate that shared common ancestry with other organisms. But again, those genetic pathways that specify what you are, what your final form is, change the way those characteristics are expressed by the time you're a juvenile and maybe an adult, right? But that comparative embryology, it's actually a whole, like it says in here, its own branch, but like a whole, I don't even want to call it a branch, like a big division of biology. Evo, Devo, evolution and development together. It's a big area of evidence for evolution there. Make sense? Okay. Changing gears a little bit here. Let's talk about biogeography. So this is the maps one. Okay, that's what geography is graphing the world, right? Looking at maps. So when you look at geographic distributions of organisms or the range in which you find an organism, you can tell a lot about its evolutionary history of not just that organism, but also its relatives. So we talk about distribution or range. Do you guys know what I'm referring to? What's the range of an organism? What does that mean? You guys know that term? Yeah, how spread out it is, where you find it. Where is it in the world? Is it found in one small area? Is it widely distributed? Where are these organisms located naturally, right? So we'll talk more about range later in the ecology unit towards the end. But for now, just understand that it's where you find an organism, okay, where it is, how it's distributed in the world. When you take those distributions and you look at the movement of the tectonic plates over geological time, what's a tectonic plate? It's all these crust plates, right? And they're moving, floating on top of the mantle, yes? You guys have a little bit of geology background, maybe? Plates are, what happens when plates like scrape up against each other, or earthquakes, volcanoes, things like that, right? So the movement of those tectonic plates over time, paired with where we find organisms, basically sums up biogeography. So the example that your textbook gives, which I think is a pretty good example, there's a family of plants called Proteaceae. You don't need to know that. It's just for an example here. These are all representative species, different genuses, genera, even, within this family called Proteaceae. But these members of this family, so families are pretty closely related organisms, they're found on all these different continents, which are widely distributed and separated by what? So the red indicates the range of members of the family Proteaceae. What are they separated by? Oceans. How do you figure flowering plant seeds get from South America to Africa? Do you think they float across the ocean? Probably not, right? That seems unlikely, not completely out of the question, but relatively unlikely, and particularly unlikely that you would find all these related organisms all across the world based on current geography, right? Seems kind of weird, but if you rewind 220 million years ago, this is what the configuration of the land masses of Earth looked like. This is Gondwana, right? So later than Pangea, but 220 million years ago, Earth formation. What do the continents look like here in Gondwana? They're all touching, right? So what are we looking at? South America, Africa. Which one is it? That's Australia, right? Maybe Asia wrapped around it. So at one point in time, these plates are all touching each other. These land masses were contiguous. Now they're separate. But that was 220 million years ago. So what can you suppose? What can you hypothesize about the origin of the common ancestor of this family of organisms? When did it appear? When did it evolve? 220 million years ago or longer, right? When these were still connected. And so as those plates moved and those continents spread, these organisms spread with the land. That's an example of how we use biogeography. Make sense? Okay. I had another good picture about the whale stuff, but it was in that book I was looking at yesterday. I'll have to make some photocopies and show you guys. It was a distribution map of some whale ancestor. Anyway, it was a good example of biogeography. Sorry, I was trying to remember there was something again online that I could show you, but it's not. So we'll just stick with the plants for now. Biogeography makes sense. All right, you guys just need to know the definitions, little examples, how it's used. And we're just talking about evidence of evolution. Okay, different ways you can ask and answer these questions. All right, so we mentioned briefly molecular biology as a means to do evolutionary research. This is literally looking at molecules, right? DNA, RNA, maybe proteins, okay? Looking at sequences of those molecules and comparing them across groups, across organisms. So this is just a paper, just an example of a paper looking at shared developmental mechanisms in gill arches and paired fins, okay? So those gill slits and legs and arms, basically, looking through vertebrates and looking at the genes that pattern those structures during embryonic development, but looking at them at the molecular level, looking at when they're turned on, what triggers them to turn on, and how those genes regulate the development of these shared characteristics. So you're still looking at anatomy, right? You're looking at homologous structures, but you're looking at them at the level of the molecules that govern their formation. Make sense? So why does this work well? DNA is universal. Every living thing uses it as its code. So you can compare, it's comparing apples to apples, right? Because apples have DNA, oranges have DNA, dogs have DNA, right? Everything does. So you can use those sequences to make comparisons. And the mechanism of replication and gene expression are also nearly universal. So all organisms use things like DNA polymerase, right? Enzymes that help build DNA molecules, or I don't know, ligase, right? To repair DNA as it's being replicated, things like that. So those mechanisms are also very similar. So you can compare across species because we all do things the same way at the molecular level. So that's another good sort of track for evolutionary biology to take. All right, so as I said, sometimes I'll link videos and oftentimes I won't play them, but this one is worth watching. So we're gonna watch this one together. I think I gotta get out of here. It's like 1 minute long. Totally worth.
Wow,
Sorry.
that really close. It has that.
So what we ended up building was basically a petri dish, except that it's 2 feet by 4 feet. And the way we set it up is that there are 9 bands, and at the base of each of these bands, we put a normal petri dish thick agar with different amounts of antibiotic. On the outside, there's no antibiotic. Just in from that, there's barely more than E. coli can survive. Inside of that, there's 10 times as much, 100 times, and then finally the middle band is 1,000 times as much antibiotic. And then across the top of it, of course, thin agar that bacteria can move around in. The background is black because they're eating it, and the bacteria appear as white.
Okay, so before we keep watching, what are they doing? What are they working with? Yeah, E. coli, bacteria, right? So they're plating bacteria. Anybody taken microbiology? Nobody yet, right? If you're heading that direction, that's later. So when you put microorganisms on a plate, usually they look like small round petri dishes. You guys know what I'm talking about? Those little clear plastic plates. They have media in the plate, growth media. It's basically like a substrate that the bacteria can grow on, and it's full of nutrients that those bacteria can use to eat and reproduce and all the other things. So it's like basically a growth plate for bacteria. So that's what they built here, only it's huge. What did he say, 4 feet by 4 feet or something like that? So it's like table-sized petri dish growing E. coli. So just to sort of clarify, because we've gone through it kind of quickly here, they divided their plate up into these different levels, and in each of these stripes, if you will, they put the antibiotics. So what do antibiotics do to bacteria? Say it? Yeah, inhibit its growth, right, at the least. So there is no antibiotic in this lane, and there's none over here, okay? So they plate the bacteria here, and they plate the bacteria here, which basically means they take a little wad and they put it into a known colony of bacteria. They just sort of spread it on the petri dish. So without antibiotic present, it should be, all the nutrients are there that it needs to grow, so it should be able to just sort of take over the dish, okay? But then what's here? Did you guys catch it? No. A little bit of antibiotic, like how much? 10 times, I think? One. Okay, describe it.
Around it. The background is black because they're
I didn't
inconnect
go that far.
and the effect. Really more
Yeah.
than the E. coli can survive. Inside of that, there's 10 times as much, 100 times, and then finally the middle band is 1,000 times as much antibiotic, and then it grows.
Okay, so these are concentrations, right? So they put a little bit of antibiotic here, then 10 times as much, 100 times as much, and 1,000 in the middle. So what do you predict will happen when these bacteria start growing in the zero antibiotic area of the plate? What do you think? Just uncontrolled growth, right? What do you think happens here? Probably going to slow down a little bit. Let's watch and we'll come back to it. We'll discuss.
Of course, in agar, the bacteria can move around it. The background is black because they're inconnect, and the bacteria appears white. First, you see they spread in the area where there's no antibiotic, up until the point they can no longer survive. Then a mutant appears on the right. It's resistant to the antibiotic, spreads until it starts to compete with other mutants around it. When these mutants hit the next boundary, they too have to pause and develop new mutations to make it 10 times as much antibiotic. And you see the different mutants repeat this at 100. And after about 11 days, they finally make it into 1,000 times as much antibiotic as the wild type can survive. And so we can see by this process of accumulating successive mutations that bacteria, which are normally sensitive to an antibiotic, can evolve resistance to extremely high concentrations in a short period of time. Process of accumulating successive mutations.
Did you guys see what happened? So here, your predictions came true, right? So in the 0% antibiotic uncontrolled growth. And then it stopped, as predicted, right? Until what appeared? Mutants, right? So when bacteria, you guys know all about bacterial reproduction from Bio 1. It's a prokaryote, right? How does it reproduce? Sexually or asexually? Asexually, binary fission, right? So how quickly can E. coli reproduce, do you think? Pretty quick. Sometimes on the order of hours to a day or so. For one cell, one organism, because they're single-celled organisms, right, to become 2 organisms. So really fast reproduction. Every time you make a new copy of yourself, what do you have to replicate? DNA. That every time you do that is an opportunity for mistakes, yes? And they happen, and sometimes they're caught and fixed, and sometimes they're not. Now, we're talking about prokaryotes. You're going to have a more simplistic set of corrective mechanisms, right, than you see in eukaryotes that have lots of chromosomes and much more complex organisms. So mutations are going to appear in something like E. coli pretty quickly, pretty often. Okay, they're going to be repaired less frequently. So mutations are really frequent in something like E. coli. Now, Are these guys who evolve these mutations to move into the antibacteria, are they the only cells that are mutating? They're not, right? They're probably all mutating, but not all mutations lead to any change in phenotype, and certainly not all mutations are going to lead to a change in phenotype that allows a bacterial cell to survive in the presence of an antibiotic. You guys with me? So what kind of mutation would that be? Deleterious, so advantageous, right? It gives them an advantage in this environment. And then you see the same thing happen at each level, right? Until you get to the middle, which has 1,000 times antibiotic concentration as what the wild type can survive. So the point of the video is actually how antibiotic resistance evolves. You guys picked up on that probably, but we're using it to look at it as evidence for evolution. If you get all the way to the end, I love this part. You know what these are? They're mutation trees or phylogenetic trees, right? It looks kind of like the one we looked at with the fish, the dolphin and the shark, only turn it on its side. Here's your root, right? Here are your nodes. Each one of these nodes represents common ancestry, but then a mutation arises and they change, right? So you've got series of successive mutations, changes in the gene pool of a population of bacteria due to what? Mutation gives the variation. What's the selective pressure? Somebody said something. Environment? It's environmental pressure. What's that exact environmental pressure? The antibiotic, right? So there's natural selection, right? That's your selective pressure. There's the presence of that antibiotic, and it's selecting for those individuals who have the mutation that gives them the advantage in that particular environment. Make sense? The cool thing about this, the reason I love to watch this video in class with you guys, is because it is showing you evolution in front of your eyes. That is so unique, because most times if you're trying to watch evolution happen, you're not going to see anything. Why not? It's slow, right? It takes generations. So let's say I want to study elephant evolution. How long does an elephant live? Probably longer than me, right, in some cases. A generation time is about 2 years, right, or gestation. So elephants are pregnant for nearly 2 years. So that's really, really slow to see changes in populations. But bacteria, man, you can watch it happen. What else mutates quickly? Microorganisms that you might be hearing about in the news. Viruses. Yep. We'll get to that too. We'll see when we get to our virus chapter. All right. So if you ever have a conversation with someone and they say, I don't believe evolution happens, you can just show them that 1-minute video and explain it, and they'll be like, oh, I see now. Understand, thank you. Speaking of misconceptions and having conversations with people, let's get through these common misconceptions. It's just about noon, so we're doing great on time. Some of these we brought up last time. We should lights back on because it's sleepy in here. You guys can see okay with the lights on, right? PowerPoint? I prefer lights on for class. You guys have a preference? I feel like it's like nap time. We turn the lights on. All right. Let's go through. There are 6 of these, and then we'll count. We'll make the misconception, and then we'll counter that misconception together. Right? If you have opinions, experiences with any of these, feel free to jump in. You can have a conversation. Evolution is just a theory. Okay, so this is a misconception, meaning things that people may say or think about evolutionary biology that aren't really true. Okay, so evolution is just a theory. Is evolution a theory? This is a trick question. Yes, it is. But what is a theory in science? Yeah, how much testing has it undergone? A lot, right? So a theory is a set of known, sort of well-supported experiments that have all worked together to support hypotheses that are related to one another until you get to the point where you can say, we really understand this very well. Here's how it works. That's a theory. What other theories are there in biology that you can think of besides evolutionary theory? How about germ theory? What does germ theory tell us? What are germs? What do germs cause? Sickness, right? They are communicable diseases, and they are caused by pathogens that can be transferred from one person to another. Germ theory. Yeah, pretty well accepted, widely tested, widely supported, well accepted theory of or explanation for a set of occurrences, right? That's a theory. What about cell theory? What does cell theory tell us? Anybody remember that from Bio 1? Cells, the fundamental unit of life. All cells come from pre-existing cells, that stuff, right? Does anybody argue with cell theory? No, it's not. No, nobody argues with that, right? It's a theory. So evolution is a theory, but in science, theory means something different than it means if I say like, oh, I have a theory about why you're always late for class. That's different, right? So we use the term theory differently in science than we do in sort of everyday conversation. Good? That makes sense? So you have to get really like nerdy and scholarly to explain that to someone. Well, theories are different in science, right? Okay, what about this one? Individuals evolve. Why is that a misconception? Correct. Individuals do not evolve, populations evolve, right? Evolution is the changes in the gene pool of a population over time, where you see the increase in advantageous traits that are coded for by those alleles, right, that appear more frequently in the gene pool. So talking about populations over time, that's a big one, right? Haven't you ever heard or read about or seen movies or whatever, people saying things like, well, if we all came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? Things like that, right? Or I didn't come from a fish. Well, nobody said you did, right? We said that there are shared common ancestors, and that populations evolve over time. So that's an important one. No one is saying that you used to be a fish and now you're a person, right? It's changes in groups of organisms over time. How about this one? We touched on this early, first day, second day. Evolution explains the origin of life. Does it? Origin of what? Species, right? So we're talking about where does diversity come from? Origin of life, that's a different question. Do we want to know the answer to that question too? Yes. Heck yeah, but it's not evolutionary biology necessarily, right? So that's not necessarily what we're talking about. Organisms evolve on purpose. Why is that a misconception? That's natural selection, which is random, really, right? Mutation is random, so variability is random. Your environment is always changing. So you can't really evolve on purpose. First of all, individuals don't evolve, so I can't just be like, right? Try to evolve, but you can't really do that. But even if you could, you have no way to predict what your environment is going to look like tomorrow, or a year from now, or 1,000 years from now, right? So there's no way to evolve on purpose. There's no goal. So evolution isn't goal-oriented. There's no like perfect form that we're all striving to achieve. It's all about who fits where and when. Make sense? How about this one? Evolution is controversial among scientists. Do you think that it is controversial among scientists? Well, it's listed as a misconception, so it mustn't be, right? It must be pretty well accepted among scientists. So there are zero peer-reviewed research articles that refute the theory of evolution. How many papers, research experiments, publications do you think there are that support that evolution is ongoing? A lot, right? I don't have a number. It's probably millions. Zero that say, we have shown that this does not happen, right? Zero. So among scientists, evolution is well accepted. It's a theory, you guys. You don't get to that status, right, without lots of research and lots of support across the years. Do you think evolution is controversial among other people? You laugh a little bit, right? Because, of course it is. Yes? So lots of argument about that. That's what all these misconceptions are coming from. But if you ask a scientist, they'll tell you, yeah, evolution happens. Because we know what it is. Change in allele frequencies, blah, 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 right? Okay, and that kind of gets us to our last one, which is an interesting foundation for discussion. I'm not opposed to having this discussion if you guys are into it. Other theories should be taught. And when I say it should be taught, I mean in school, like public school K-12, right? So have you heard that argument before? Like, you can't teach evolution in school unless you also teach alternate explanations, like intelligent design or creation, right? You guys heard that before? It was actually a really big deal 30 years ago or so. Couldn't even teach evolution in public schools. But now there's argument. Okay, well, if you're going to teach my kid evolution, you got to also teach him intelligent design. What does intelligent design say? Do you guys know? That there has to be what behind biodiversity? A designer, right? So it's, sorry? Yeah, so special creation and intelligent design are two different things, right? This is more along the lines of religious, right? Like, there is a creator and everything was created by that creator for a purpose in its place. That's how it works, right? Now, intelligent design is a little bit different than that, right? A little bit. So maybe you can be a proponent of intelligent design and still understand how evolution works, but you're saying there's a force behind it and we don't know what that force is. Okay, so it's a little bit different than saying like, it's God, right? You guys are all with me. Or it's something and we don't know what it is, okay? But okay, let me just preface this by saying there is absolutely nothing wrong with having these conversations, yes? It's interesting. Theology, religion, it's all very interesting and it's all very personal and it's whatever, cool. I don't know. Right? I don't have the answer. We don't have the answer. And you know why we don't have the answer? Because these are things that cannot be measured. You with me? These are not scientific theories. Why not? Can you gather data on the designer? Do you have evidence, empirical evidence, meaning measurable, observable evidence of a creator? You don't, right? Because you can't. Because that's not a question that you can address with the scientific method. It's kind of like beauty, right? So can I measure color? I can't, right? I can tell you what wavelength of light is being reflected by an object. I can tell you what our brain's perceiving it as. We can measure all that. Can I measure how beautiful that color is? Can you measure beauty? You can't, right? You can take a poll, but that's different. You can't gather observable, measurable data on beauty. It's just that there are some questions that you cannot ask. You can ask, but you can't answer using the scientific method. And because of that, these are not scientific theories. And because of that, you can't teach them alongside evolutionary theory, which is backed up by things like our bacteria video we just watched. Does that make sense? The difference between empirical or evidence-based theory versus theology or religion or some other sort of topic that's not measurable empirically. Make sense? So good luck having that discussion with your relatives at Thanksgiving or whenever this comes up in your life. But now you're maybe now you're a little bit better equipped to have those conversations if they come up. Or sometimes it's better to just sit quietly and like eat your stuff and let it go. Right? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. Anyway, moving on. Questions, comments, concerns, experiences you may have had with conversations like this.
So that's when they stopped teaching it 3 years ago, right? They made like the decision that because it can't be measured, they shouldn't teach it along something that can be.
Well, it really comes down to separation of church and state more than it does saying you can't teach religion in schools. What they were saying is that you can't teach evolution in schools. And then there was a whole like legal case that said, yes, you can. Yeah.
What they do now is just basically just mention that there's other theories out there. Yeah.
And that's fine.
But the main one they focus on is, the one that we are learning.
Evolutionary
They
biology.
just mention that there are more than one theory.
Yeah. Well, because I think that makes sense too, because if you say this is completely invalid, the only answer is science, you are alienating half of your audience at least, right? Depending upon where you are, what country you're in, what geographical region you're in, what the demographic is. Because if I come in and I start telling you everything you've believed for your whole life is wrong, you are immediately going to think everything I say is stupid after that, right? So it doesn't make sense. Yeah, this is valid, it's just not science. And so that distinction is really important. So if any of you are going into education as a career or thinking about it, that's kind of the difference, right? That's why it's important. So yeah, we have to focus on evolutionary biology in biology because it's the only scientific theory with evidence that we have to explain the origin of species and how things change over time. Like where it all came from and what's the meaning of it all, that's a different class, right? That's philosophy or theology or religion, yeah.
So is intelligent design kind of like when people think that we live in simulation or whatever? Is that okay?
I mean, I think that could be one of the arms of it, right?
Like I'm just trying to figure out like an example.
Yeah, like we live in the Matrix.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. I think a better example of what intelligent design would be saying something like, a good example that's often cited by intelligent design proponents is eyes. So eyeballs are super complex, right? And that the complexity that's expressed in these characteristics, like the structure of an eyeball that leads to vision, is far too complex to explain through random mutation, that there has to be an intelligent designer behind this plan because it couldn't have just done it on its own. Does that make sense? But living in the Matrix would be another like branch of that, right? Talking about like it's all just simulation. It's really weird and existential. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are people who like believe like in God and everything, and then there's like scientists who specifically believe in like evolution. Are there like scientists who believe that like God created things, but then they evolved from what God created?
Sure.
Would that be a thing?
Sure. Why not? Right? So it's really, they're two separate things. So you can understand, and I don't want to say believe in evolution because that's really something that you have to believe in because there's evidence. You can like see it and you're like, oh, I can understand how that works now. So you can accept the evidence that explains how things change, but also have the theological reasoning that there must be something behind it, but you don't know what it is. Or I know what it is, and it's God, and God is a woman, and she looks like that. You know what I'm saying? Like that part's up to you.
Yeah.
Hypotheticals, you guys. You can choose to believe what faith is different than science, right? And you can have both.
But so they can intermingle.
Sure. For sure. You don't have to choose. I think there are definitely scientists, famous scientists, right, who come out as atheists, like Carl Sagan and other guy's name. I'm losing the name that's not coming to mind right away. But there are also plenty of scientists who say that are also religious. So Doug Banshee. So early in this, we're about done, so I'm going to just rewind all the way back to the beginning. That quote that I gave you guys.
I just always have this interpretation. I guess like the way people say like, oh, you're so whatever, like for some reason I just have always thought that all science is right.
Right.
I just got that interpretation. But there can be scientists who are religious but also
Yeah.
okay.
Sure. You don't have to choose. They're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
And you can have both. They're two different things.
Okay.
Now, there are certainly people who say you got to choose.
Yeah.
You know, but that's also a matter of personal choice. What I was going to tell you guys is if you look at this essay, it'll give you more background on Adaptations, who is a famous, well-respected evolutionary geneticist, super religious. So a lot of what his writing in this essay is talking about is how it is blasphemous to not believe in evolutionary biology. So it's kind of an interesting merger. So it might be something to check out if you're interested in it. All right, guys, so I think that's a good place to stop with those misconceptions, and we'll pick up about